So I was on a plane to and from New Orleans this week, and that's where I catch up on all my movies. On the way back, I finished Guy Ritchie's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, based on a true story of a group of clandestine British operatives in World War II who were basically ordered by Churchill to set Europe ablaze as their way of trying to fight back. And so these operatives risked everything to strike back at the Germans. The main character, Gus March Phillips, was one of the early innovators in irregular warfare operations. He's thought to be whom Ian Fleming modeled James Bond after. Tragically, in real life, he died in 1942 in an operation in France. Two of the other main characters were killed in action in World War II. One in Sicily in 1943, another in Italy in 1945. He was killed attacking German positions, trying to create a diversion for other Allied forces. They risked everything for the cause, as all soldiers do when entering battle. It's this costly endeavor, and they go into it knowing the potential cost that they may have to pay. And I was thinking about the cost of things when reading this passage from Luke on Zacchaeus. And this section, it's all about the costs of various actions. And when we see how people act, and when we understand the cost they're bearing, we start to get a clear picture of the beauty of the gospel and how it sets people free. And if we let it read us, it ought to challenge us to think about what it is that we're holding on to, what costs we're bearing willingly for the sake of the gospel. And it should also trigger us to think about the cost that Christ paid to deliver us from sin and death. So to set the scene, Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is a tax collector, which means he is a Jew who has decided to collaborate with the Romans. Romans are the occupying army. He has the strength of the Roman army to enforce his collections, but the people all around, they hate him because he's working with the enemy. He's despised, but he's chosen to pay that price of his reputation to have money and security. Tax collectors are notoriously corrupt because they can collect as much as they like. As long as they remit the appropriate amount back to Rome, they can keep whatever else. And they've got the Roman army at their dispatch to enforce their collections. So because of their corruption, because they're working with the enemy, people hate them. And to give you a picture of how people feel about tax collectors, lying to them was condoned. There was an exception to one of the Ten Commandments because of how tax collectors were. Zacchaeus, his family, would have been considered unclean, but they accepted all of that. They said, this is the price we'll pay because it means that we can be rich. Right? Can you believe that people would sacrifice what they believed in just to be rich? How things have changed over the years. Plenty of other people obviously make this decision, sacrificing moral virtue to be rich, to be powerful, turning their back on the community so they can get what they want. They decide that's a price they're willing to pay. It's a cost that they will bear. But the decision obviously left Zacchaeus empty, because when he hears that Jesus is coming through Jericho, he must see him. And what's interesting, Jesus isn't going to Jericho. He's really just passing through. He's on his way to Jerusalem. Zacchaeus is intrigued, and so he does two things that men at the time would not have done. He runs, and then he climbs a tree. Again, people at the time did not do these things. Children might have, but men did not. And this tree, it wasn't in town. A sycamore tree couldn't be planted within 100 feet of the city, because anything that happened under the tree that was unclean made everybody else under the tree unclean as well. And since sycamore trees had a wide spread of their branches, there were rules about where they could be planted. And so this one would have been outside of the town. It has these low, wide branches. So Zacchaeus is hiding there, hoping not to be seen, but he wants to see Jesus. So Zacchaeus goes out to find Jesus, but much to his surprise, Jesus is looking for Zacchaeus. Jesus stops by the tree and calls him out. And it's intended to be this great word of comfort, this word of hope for us. So often, we talked about last week, we feel lost. And so we try to figure out, how do we find our way out of here? And lo and behold, Jesus is the good shepherd. Jesus comes after us. So Zacchaeus is lost. Zacchaeus thinks, I got to find Jesus. And then lo and behold, Jesus is searching for Zacchaeus. And then the Jesus who was just passing through Jericho decides he's going to stay at the house of Zacchaeus. The guest chose the host. This doesn't happen. But Jesus came with intent. People are really angry about this. They're grumbling about this. Whatever anger they had at Zacchaeus, they're transferring it to Jesus. So for Jesus, this is a very costly decision. He could have walked by. The people would have stayed mad at Zacchaeus, would not have been mad at Jesus. But in choosing to dine with Zacchaeus, Jesus assumes the position as the target of their anger. It's a price he willingly pays. This is a costly decision. But having dinner with Zacchaeus is worth it to Jesus. He didn't have to. He chose to, because he thought that what he was going to receive for bearing that cost was worth it. So they go and they have dinner. Something happens during that dinner. Zacchaeus is a changed man. He is transformed. He spends time with Jesus. He stands up and he declares half of his wealth will be given to the poor. And if he's defrauded anyone, which it certainly implies that he has, he will restore it fourfold. Just think about Zacchaeus. He's been willing to sacrifice the community, to be viewed as unclean, to be the one person in the village that people can lie to without punishment. He's absorbed all of this so that he can be wealthy. And over the course of one dinner, he's willing to give all of it up. If as little as 12.5% of his wealth is gotten by fraud, which it certainly is very likely given the reputation of tax collectors, then he will not be able to afford to fulfill this promise. But he makes the decision to do so at great cost to himself because of this pursuit of Jesus, because Jesus works some transformation in him. Zacchaeus discovers the God who was searching for him. Even before Zacchaeus started looking for Jesus, something happened over that meal. Grace transformed him. And grace came first. Jesus came to the house first. This is Zacchaeus' response. And that grace, it wasn't cheap grace, it's costly grace. Jesus absorbs the anger that was targeted towards Zacchaeus, the one who was despised in town. Later on in Luke's Gospels, at the end of all of the Gospels, Jesus absorbs far more than one town's anger. He'll face the anger from the crowds before Pilate, and then all of the world's violence, all of the world's hatred, the discord, the wrath will be poured out upon him, and he will take it all because he loves us. This is the price that Jesus pays to redeem humanity from sin. And he absorbs it all. He pays that price because he values us so deeply, because he loves us. And the story naturally then leaves a question in front of us. How does the love of Christ that searches us out, that comes into our hearts and lives, how does it leave us transformed? There's no follow-up to the story. Wouldn't you love to know what happened to Zacchaeus afterwards, what the life in Jericho was like afterwards? We'd love to know what came next, but we don't. And in so many ways, right, it's because that's our life. We stand in that place. Jesus comes to us and dines with us. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. And whoever opens the door, he comes in and he dines with us. And then what? How are we changed? How is our faith costly to us? We have paid costs throughout our lives. We all make choices to obtain the things that we want. And so many of those things, those are the things by which we measure our value. We measure our kingdom, things we've accumulated over the years. But when we see Christ in front of us, do we see a God of such surpassing value that we'll pay any price to let that kingdom reign in our lives and in our hearts? How costly is our faith? Do we open our hands and let go of all of the things that we're clinging so tightly to so that we might hang on to God? Do we long to show the world how transformed we are, and in so doing, invite them all to come and know the God who chases after them? Grace changed Zacchaeus. He seems to be marked by sacrifice, by generosity, by joy in a way he never was beforehand. And Jesus says salvation has come to this house, not because of Zacchaeus' actions, but because of the transformation that has taken place in his heart. Grace never leaves us where we are. May it continue to change us, that our lives may reflect the radical generosity of Christ in a world in desperate need of that story. There's a lot of opportunities to give. These are vitally important when we think about what's going on in the world. We as a church, we as a presbytery are going to be assembling the cleanup buckets for the Presbyterian Disaster Assistance. We can take part in that. We have our annual pledge drive coming up. We can take part in that. Here at Highlands, we've hired a new church secretary. It'd be great for you to stop by, welcome her, help her become part of the community. It's a way you can give back. There are countless needs. How do we think about how do we give back out of what we have received? How do we think about the cost of discipleship, of our time, of our resources? But mostly, how do we think about being touched by grace in the same way that Zacchaeus is? I hope that we're amazed at the God who pursues us. Even when we're hidden under the branches of a tree on the outskirts of town, I hope we realize that God who comes in and dines with us and changes us so that it impacts the way we look at the world. That's what I want for us, to get up every day and be amazed that Jesus Christ chooses to pay a great cost to obtain us, to redeem us, to buy us back. And so then I think, how do I respond to that? How do I look around at what I have, and how do I respond with the same generosity and joy and sacrifice that Zacchaeus has, and realize that the cost relative to what Christ has done is minute. And so how do I pour myself out in the same way that Christ poured himself out for me? And how do I have that same eternal perspective where I look at my resources as a chance to proclaim a risen Christ? Right? Each of us responds differently to the gospel, but I hope that in the same way that Zacchaeus was amazed when Christ came to him, I hope that we're amazed as well. That's my prayer for us.